I will answer. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Appropriation 2014-15 Estimates Bill, adjourned debate on second reading and amendment proposed thereto.
Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr Speaker, I rise to support in the most fulsome way this excellent budget of the Finance Minister, the Honourable Bill English. Mr Speaker, the 6th budget of the Finance Minister, and as he pointed out last week, it is also similar to the number of children that the Finance Minister has, Mr Speaker. And that means there's a number of us pondering, having a discussion with his good lady wife as to whether we could possibly extend the brood to make sure we get further good quality budgets like this one, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this budget, as it says on the cover, is what it says on the tin. It's about managing a growing economy, Mr Speaker. And yes, we have a strongly growing economy, one of the fastest growing in the OECD last year, likely to be one of the fastest growing in the OECD this year, and likely...
Well, I wasn't interrupting the honourable member. I was actually bringing the House to order. Courtesy is contagious, but the member may continue.
Mr Speaker, it was the fast-growing economy in the OECD, one of the fastest-growing economies in the OECD last year, one of the fastest-growing this year, and, Mr Speaker, likely to be one of the fastest-growing in the OECD next year, Mr Speaker. And that is because, firstly, of the fantastic fiscal management of this Finance Minister, but also of a range of other initiatives. And, Mr Speaker, I'd like to focus on a few of those that are part of the government's very successful business growth agenda, which is being well supported by businesses who want to invest and grow jobs up and down this country, Mr Speaker. And if you look through the BGA, there are a number of new initiatives this year, including extending the investment in New Zealand trade and enterprise to help expand its support for businesses as they grow offshore around the world, $69 million over 4 years there, Mr Speaker. Increased investment in the science area through science and innovation funding, $58.6 million over 3 years. The approach of tax exemptions for loss-making start-up companies to allow them to cash out part of their tax losses, the R&D black hole expenditure, and, of course, the centres of research excellence. In the skills space, we've talked at question time this afternoon about the investments in tertiary education. In infrastructure, there's significant investments in transport and for Kiwi Rail's turnaround plan, and also significant investments in the Hobsonville Land Company housing development. And in the natural resources space, we've had the Future Investment Fund money for Crown irrigation and, of course, as just mentioned in question time, the Kauri dieback program. So, Mr Speaker, this budget is a budget that is focused on encouraging New Zealand to continue to grow over the longer term, and that is a good thing for the New Zealand economy, but most of all, that's a good thing for New Zealand families, Mr Speaker. And this government stands proudly on its record now of 6 excellent budgets under the tutelage of the Prime Minister and, of course, our Minister of Finance. So, Mr Speaker, we come to the other options we could have had standing here today in terms of talking about a budget. And, of course, this is what the opposition might have done, Mr Speaker. And the opposition are now telling us, in their latest manifestation, that they would be as fiscally responsible as the current government, Mr Speaker. That is their current statement of the day, Mr Speaker. Mr Cunliffe gets up there, puts the nerd face on and goes, oh, no, we'd be as fiscally as responsible as the current government. Except that they wouldn't, Mr Speaker, because we have to remind ourselves of what they've said over the last few years. For example, one finance spokesman for the Labor Party in 2009 said, we need a bigger stimulus package, Mr Speaker. How could anybody call this robust? New Zealanders have watched an American president take office and take action, passing a $1.5 trillion stimulus bill. They look across the Tasman and they see a government prepared to move heaven and earth with a $67 billion stimulus package, Mr Cunliffe said adoringly. And now, Mr Speaker, when the chickens are coming home to roost across the Tasman, oh no, we'd be as responsible as the National Party, Mr Speaker, in terms of our fiscal responsibility. And then you go back to, it's not just once, Mr Speaker, also in 2011 he signalled Labor would increase its borrowing so it could spend more than National's $1.1 billion allowance. That was at the end of 2009, Mr Speaker. And then he said, you cannot be driven simply by government debt as your overriding concern, Mr Speaker. That was another speech from Mr Cunliffe when he argued there should be more expenditure again. And then there's the one where Mr Cunliffe called the national government's spending packages timid, and Labor would have spent more, Mr Speaker. So that's what they actually said at the time, and yet today, oh, we would have got back into surplus the same time as everybody else, Mr Speaker. And so, but let's test it again. Let's look across the front bench. Let's look across the front bench and see what they would have done. Well, we'll start with Grant Robertson, Mr Speaker. He who has not seen a student he doesn't want to spend more money on. And in the three times he was tertiary education spokesperson, he opposed every single change to save money so we could spend more elsewhere in the tertiary system, Mr Speaker. And then there was David Cunliffe, another great spender, as I've said. Annette King, never seen enough spent on health, and has constantly criticised Tony Ryle for not spending more on health. And then Jacinda Ardern, one-time spokesperson on social development, today moaning that the government had not spent more in the lower income areas. And finally, Mr Twyford, Mr Phil Twyford, who sits there saying, we've filled 100,000...
Member will refer to another member by their proper name, by his nickname or anything else.
I corrected it, Mr Speaker. You keep going. Anyway, Mr Twyford, Mr Speaker, who's in his house building plan, wants to spend anything up to $20 billion replacing the private sector on housing. And that's just their front bench. So you have a leader who spent the entire time wishing he could have been Barack Obama or Kevin Rudd and actually spent a lot of money through the GFC. And now, even today, we have a front bench, of course, not anymore with the late lamented and the only person that was interested in growth, Shane Jones. He's gone, Mr Speaker, but they want to spend more and borrow more, Mr Speaker. But, Mr Speaker, there are other issues to deal with, including the latest problems that have apparently manifested themselves since the budget. We have now got not one but two new crises to deal with on top of all the other crises that the opposition have been consumed with over the last few years, Mr Speaker. You may recall the regional crisis. That was a massive crisis in the regions where 2 days before the census came out, the leader of the opposition at the time, apparently still the leader now, actually wandered out and said there'd been a massive departure of people from the regions, except there hasn't, Mr Speaker. And in fact, the ANZ's come out today and said every single region in New Zealand's grown in the last year, including Otago, which went up 4.5%. So where's that little Dr David Clark now? 4.5% in Otago. The crisis continues in Otago. And then there's the manufacturing crisis, another fantastic crisis, Mr Speaker. And the manufacturing sector has now been in expansion for 19 consecutive months, Mr Speaker. And then we have the export crisis, which was immediately followed by the highest ever New Zealand dollar value of exports leaving New Zealand, Mr Speaker. So the two new crises, Mr Speaker. We have the housing crisis. Unfortunately for the opposition, the only difficulty with the housing crisis is it was a lot worse when they were in government, Mr Speaker. It's the only slight problem with the housing crisis. But nevertheless, let's roll with that sucker for a minute, because let's have a look at the housing crisis under Labor. So, under Labor, house prices doubled over 9 years in the country. Under National, they've gone up 16% in 5 years, Mr Speaker. So that's a crisis, there's no doubt about that. But the latest one, the one I love now, is the immigration crisis. There is now the immigration crisis. Well, let's analyse that just for a second, Mr Speaker. In the year to March 2014, 32,000 people net came into New Zealand, which is about 30-odd thousand more than 2 years ago, 35,000 in fact. And that means What's happened, Mr Speaker? Well, actually, it mostly is less New Zealanders moving to Australia, Mr Speaker, something the Labor Party used to be concerned about. 24,000, two-thirds of that reduction, more than two-thirds, are people who haven't moved to Australia. But apparently it's causing house price problems in Auckland, except that most of these people that haven't moved to Australia haven't left their provinces. It's nothing to do with Auckland. 19,000 of the 24,000 are still living in Dunedin, still living in Napier, still living in Invercargill, where they're slightly bemused to see Mr Twyford popping up at their window and saying, "Are you buying houses in Auckland, Mr Speaker?" It's not happening. And that's the trouble with the opposition. They're a bunch of panic merchants that don't understand that actually it's about sensible economic growth, and that's what this government delivers, Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Interesting that he didn't talk about his own budget. There's nothing to talk about in it. They're one-trick ponies on the other side. They think that the only thing to be done is to balance the budget. Mr. Speaker.